Is there any way we can convince Labor to remove one of the planks of Gonski, which was embedded by Julia Gillard on a very false premise, that no school will lose $1? Now, when Gillard embedded that at the very beginning of Gonski and delayed legislating it for 18 months, she's actually skewered her own very, very good needs-based funding policy. So that needs to go, but when Mark Latham tried that in the 2004 election, where he revived the old Whitlam-Carmel 12 categories of funding and got rid of category 1 and 2 receiving any funding at all, he said that they were scarified by it. The other part that they need to really embrace is to reverse the decimation of TAFE. And that decimation of TAFE has been done by both Labor and Liberal governments, both state and federal, and it needs to be reversed as a matter of urgency.
I'm not an expert on education, but I very much agree with the sentiments you express in that question. And I think what is happening to TAFE is just very disturbing. I mean, it's the mindless application of free market ideology to education and the belief that the market and deregulation and privatisation can solve everything. Your question was about what can we do about this, and I guess part of what I was saying was that there's this policy, there's that policy. What matters is the kind of overall framework which Labor needs to, the overall framework that Labor needs to put forward, and that's why I was stressing this idea of progressive populism. To more directly answer your question, what can be done? The answer is, I guess, the same as on many other questions, that is the mobilisation of unions, social organisations and so on to target that particular question. Because in the end it comes down, I was discussing with Eva Cox earlier, it's not a matter of reasoned debate, it's a matter of how many forces you can mobilise to try and fight certain aspects of policies that let the side down.
Look, Wyn, it's a really good question, and I think nothing makes me crankier than seeing, the incredibly well-off private schools in this area. These two federal electorates have the highest proportion of parents sending their kids to private schools in Australia. And that's why I said at the beginning, if you want my wish list, my actual policy list, it talks about banning private schools. If I had my way, I would ban private schools. It is outrageous that they are getting a cent of public money for having the fifth oval and the second swimming pool. It just outrages me. However, we are facing a real fight at the moment to try and get the last 2 years of the Gonski funding even happening. So the issue about no money going, because really what you're talking about is, that no school will lose $1. What you're saying is there are some schools that should lose $1. And I totally agree with you. But at the moment, and I was just talking about this with David, I don't want the good to be sacrificed for the perfect. It would be perfect if we could just stop all state aid to private schools, but that's not going to happen this time. So what we've got to really fight for is that last 2 years of Gonski funding, because that's crucial.
One of the issues is, it's all very well talking about progressive populism, but I do wonder whether or not we can have a progressive populism that really ignores most of the social issues. And that gets back to the area which, in a sense, Meredith was also talking about, is that real absence of the serious social issues from the agenda. We've got a lot of discussion about inequality, we've got a lot of discussions about that, but nobody mentions welfare payments. Nobody mentions the fact that childcare has just been stuffed up by removing children who don't have a work-related need. We don't mention the fact that Aboriginal policies are appalling, because basically the distinction between what Labor did in the Aboriginal affairs and what the Coalition did in Aboriginal affairs is pretty slight and very limited. So, we don't even discuss them. There's bipartisanship about that. There's bipartisanship about a whole lot of, as I say, welfare issues. there's bipartisanship around the refugee stuff. So many of those areas which hit an emotional button, and one of the issues about populism is it appeals to people's emotions, are actually almost taboo because they might antagonise particular people, and you do have that sort of problem of playing into whether or not we're dealing with the inner city elites or the sort of western suburbs blue-collar people who are all supposed to be prejudiced, which I suspect they're not nearly as prejudiced as people expect them to be. But I suppose my question is, if Labor fails to deliver on those things which cause some quite strong emotional pull, are they going to actually impress people by just having an economic version of progressive populism without a social one? After all, socialism was one of the bases of Australia's, of Labor's background, and social does not mean economic. Economic is a social science, but a very bad one.
I'd just like to say that I agreed with almost everything David said. The one thing I was very hesitant when he started talking about progressive populism, because the whole point about populism is that it seeks to make simple that which is actually complex. And you can see this with Donald Trump. He is the ultimate populist. He makes it really simple. He says, you can stop, Mexicans coming here, you just build a wall. Or, you can stop terrorism, you just don't let Muslims into America. It is making things simple. And I agree with a lot of what Bernie Sanders is saying, but one of the things he does, which I get quite cranky about, is he also assumes that everything's simple. And he says, Obamacare isn't good enough. So we just abolish Obamacare and we'll start again and get something much better. And everyone goes, hooray. And the fact that it took 4 years to get up Obamacare, and yes, it isn't perfect, but it took 4 years of fighting and negotiation. And unfortunately, politics is really complex and you're rarely going to get a perfect result. And populism, unfortunately, just makes things simple, and they're not. So I think even progressive populism has to be really looked at, and you have to be able to say exactly how are you going to do that, because most of the time it's a lot harder than you think.
I agree with you, Eva. I certainly didn't mention a whole range of social issues when talking about this notion of progressive populism. What I did do was to try and find or think about what would be the common ground that would unite the largest number of people that would start a bit of a bandwagon for Labor to win. And those issues, by and large, are economic. That is what has the most potential to unite people. That doesn't mean you don't mention those other issues, but I wasn't addressing those issues. As far as tapping the emotions of people, which is certainly what populism does, I think there's plenty of righteous emotion to be tapped in inequality, in what's happening to jobs, in what's happening to the education system and so on. I think this notion of progressive populism, sure, it can, populism as a general term can mean all kinds of things. As I said, there's all sorts of right-wing populisms, there's a kind of anti-Semitic populism, etc., etc., etc. But that's not what doesn't mean you should run away from the idea that the interests of ordinary people are different from those of the elite, in this case a corporate elite. And I think that's a good way of framing things.
How can we develop political will and courage for the Labour Party to actually break from that being almost a Siamese twin of the Labour Party at this point, and really become different, to dare sing a different tune, and even displease corporate media?
I suspect, did you come in late?
No.
Oh. Well, I gave you 15 really important contestable items where a lot of them economic, where the Labor Party was taking one position and the Conservatives were taking another position. Now, I accept that sometimes in the past there have been times when you could run the argument, they're exactly the same. They're not. And every time we get a Liberal government, people come up to me and say, this is terrible. And I say, I didn't vote for them. go and complain to someone else. Because people only understand the difference between a Conservative government and a Labor government when the Conservative government gets in and starts doing terrible things. So, and as I say, I gave you 15, and I'm not going to go through them again, I gave you 15 really important things where we were very different.
But how come the TPP, which is obviously a subordination of human rights, and
the Labor
racial
Party fought very hard against that part of the TPP which talked about the fact that that was the Chinese agreement, where if a corporation was more than $150 million, it could bring in its own workforce. So the Labor Party has had differences over trade practices. If you want to have an argument about free trade versus protection, I believe in free trade and I believe in free labour. And that means that I want the whole world to be I'm an international socialist. I believe that the whole world should be a trading nation where trade is free, but also labour can be free too. And, I'm happy to have an argument about that.
Well,
Yeah, fair trade.
I don't agree that the parties are like Siamese twins. It's just the situation that we have to deal with. I mean, it's no point denouncing it. There's no point. Sure, we can denounce it, the problems, and I've done some of that myself. But the point is to try and work out what is the strategic response to the situation, and that's why I've come up with this notion of progressive populism. It's not the perfect answer, but part of the problem is that a lot of what the left has been saying doesn't resonate with the broad masses of people who vote, in or out of elections. And we keep repeating the same formulae. It's not true, by the way, that the media controls the political system. I think there's enough people around here with grey heads who will remember that in our youth, in the Vietnam period, there was the movement for radical change burst through against total media opposition. There was no Guardian, there was no Saturday paper, there was no smaller Liberal in Fairfax in the 60s and 70s. The media doesn't control the political, although everyone loves to hate the mass media, and there's lots of good reasons for doing it. They don't control the parties, they don't control the political situation. That's why earlier on I emphasised it's the independent mass mobilisation of people on campaigns that appeal broadly. That's what can change the situation.
I think this discussion is actually very interesting as part of what we need is a very major discussion about the state of politics in Australia and the world. I don't know what other people think. When I look over in the United States and I see a guy who describes himself as a democratic socialist in serious contention for leading the Democratic Party, serious contention. There's some argument that he's been dudded and that he could win under a properly democratic system. But I want to also raise the question of Jeremy Corbyn, which might be more relevant to the Australian situation, certainly ALP. I think there is a change in the world political situation at the moment. And Meredith mentioned the question of class war. I think the class war is escalating, and the neoliberal offensive we've faced for the last 30 years or so, there is a blowback. There's a blowback happening. That's what's happening in the United States. How many people look at those pictures of Bernie Sanders, who sort of looks like me with white hair, surrounded by 20,000 20-year-olds. This is amazing. And Jeremy Corbyn getting up there and challenging David Cameron, who may go down the tubes, by the way, because of the Panama Papers. This is amazing. And I think we have to situate Australian politics in that. There is an escalation of the class war. So what I actually strongly support the Labor Party's decision, which I think they had a lot of thinking about, to launch this proposal for a Royal Commission into the banks. Look, if the single biggest thing the Labor Party could do is launch a war on the banks, and a war on the rich, and war on Malcolm Turnbull, ex-banker, and Mike Baird, ex-banker. The ruling class has decided no longer they're outsourcing their leadership to someone like Abbott. They're actually, you have to be a banker to be a political leader of the right wing. So, cutting a long story short, the Labor Party has been going down a track for some long time. They ditched the socialisation objective. I think they've got to go back to that. Well, all right, it's in the very fine print now then. It's extremely fine print. And in fact, Albo denounced socialism in this very room earlier this year. But anyway, I think one of the worst decisions of the Labor government was the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And now we are seeing the results of what happened there. If the Commonwealth Bank had still been in public hands, the actual treasury of the federal government would be in a lot better shape today than what it is now.
Well, you might make that your question.
All right, my question is, I would like to advocate a return to the proposal for the nationalisation and renationalisation of the banking industry. That needs to be something that comes out of this Royal Commission, either directly as a term of reference or something that the Labor Party takes out of that. I wonder what our speakers think.
Thanks, Jim. I think what has happened in the last couple of years, very, very slowly and almost imperceptibly, the tide has changed against neoliberalism, partly because of the global financial crisis and the response to the anti-austerity movement and so on. I guess we're all used to living in a world where that ideology still reigns supreme, but I think it's had some really bad damage done to it. And the problem that creates, of course, is, well, what do we stand for? Jim says renationalise the banks. Well, maybe. I once had a chat to John Button, the late Labor luminary, and I said, is there anything you ever regret in the Hawke government? And he said, well, not many things, but yes, I don't think we should have privatised the Commonwealth Bank. Jolly good. But I mean, if neoliberalism's moment is passing, which I think it is, that puts the wood on the left, the progressives, to say, well, what do you actually say should happen? And that is a much harder question to answer, I think, than defaulting to something that says, let's renationalise the banks.
Thank you, Jim, for your input. And I will say that my sister and brother-in-law, good trots, both rejoined the British Labor Party so that they could vote for Jeremy Corbyn, and we're still very pleased. And you know, I would have voted for him too. I just think that it's fantastic he's there. And still standing, which is amazing. Well, hope so. I think Corbyn's a bit different to Sanders in that Corbyn has had an experience of trying to get things to happen. The problem with Sanders is he's always been a legislator rather than part of executive government. And in the American system, legislators never have to actually do anything. All they ever do is try to stop things happening. And I suspect that's one of Sanders' problems and why he's not totally realistic about things like Obamacare. However, I would like to put to rest that absolute calumny that Jim did put forward, that we had knocked off the socialist objective. The left of the Labor Party put up a huge fight about that, and it is still there on the back of our ticket. I do carry it around with me. I further pledge that I will actively support the Constitution, platform and principles of the Australian Labor Party, including the democratic socialisation of industry, production, distribution and exchange to the extent necessary to eliminate exploitation and other antisocial features in these fields and the pursuit of social justice and equality in all areas of human endeavour. Now that has been exactly the same wording ever since I've been in the Labor Party, which is 45 years. So if the Trot's going to go around criticising us, you've got to get it.
Election platform, nowhere.
It's on the back of our ticket, and it's, you know, not a. That's the only thing on the back of our ticket, so it's what we believe in.
Reflecting on the topic of tonight's talk, and thank you for your points so far, just wondering if you had just one or two top bullet points on removing our incumbent in Warringah.
In Warringah, you mean Tony Abbott?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, make life as difficult as possible for him. I mean, I know members of the Liberal Party, some of them are in my family, and the Liberal Party is divided on Abbott. We hear a lot, and Meredith is right in saying Abetz and Kevin Anderson and so on are making life hard for Turnbull. There are plenty of people in the Liberal Party who think Abbott was a disgrace and a shocking Prime Minister. Obviously, that's why they got rid of him. I don't have any sort of simple solutions as to what to bowl up to Tony Abbott in Warringah, except to ask him what's his long-term perspective. When he got done, he said, "Look, I'm 57. I'm too young to retire." Well, fair enough. But why is he? What's his future prospects? What's his future plans as a member for Warringah?
Look, I know I should be totally supportive of the democratic process and not say these things, but I think it's wonderful that Tony's standing again. He's going to sit there on the back bench glowering at Turnbull, and it just shows that the Liberal Party is really divided. There is open warfare going on at the moment. If you watch any of those sort of commentary programs, the journos are all loving it because journos love colour and movement. They love a bit of a split going on, and unfortunately the Labor Party is really boring at the moment because no one's trying to do anything there. So they're really working hard on what is Tony Abbott doing now, what is Eric Abetz doing now, and it's distracting for Turnbull and it's fun for the rest of us.
I wonder about the Labour Party strategy now that say that people first. This is the phrase that they send, to me in my email. That's what do you think? We care about the people, and the people has to be first. So I want to know exactly what means people first. Many people get $8-10 working, 12, 14 hours a day, 7 days, and then can be, if you are Australian, you have to accept that. Otherwise, we take the international one. They are not going to say anything, they are not going to claim anything. And this country is running in these people, and nobody can see it. So just tell me, where is the people first?
I think right at the beginning you asked the question, why does Labor say people first? I guess the reason they say that is people first, not corporate profits first. There's an old lefty slogan, people before profits, and I think it's still a good one. Why does Australia cut things and privatise things? I guess because everybody's in the grip of neoliberal ideology. And as I said in answer to an earlier question, there are so many injustices, including the ones you point out about low pay, illegal pay actually. People are being paid $8, $10, $12 an hour. That is actually illegal. But they go on because there is no counterposing narrative to say why this is wrong and what Labor can do about it.
Can I just say the terminology and the use of language and the way in which the Conservatives and the media just daily do anti-union stuff all the time. It is just a relentless anti-union message that keeps getting out. And that is what causes the 7-Eleven employees to be being paid $6, $7 an hour. It's because there is no acceptance that unions are actually good things that actually protect workers' entitlements. Now, there is no way in the world that workers would be getting the sorts of wages that you're talking about if they were unionised. And if unions aren't allowed into the workplace and are not, in fact, accepted as an important part of people's working lives, then people will be exploited. It all comes down to anti-unionist rhetoric, and it comes down to the fact that people don't join unions. And I'm shocked when I discover that, you know, in my son's workplace, he's the only one in the union. If people were in the union, those sort of wages would not be able to happen.
How the detail of what is actually needed in the environmental argument, how passion and conviction can be put into it with good stories about what will be happening. And in education, could you fill in some of that social detail that once again would communicate conviction and passion? All we hear so far is equality, but the detail of what's missing and how it's going to be, how equality is actually going to be gained, has been missing.
Look, I agree, Charlie, that on issues like climate change and education, often it just becomes a bit boring to have discussion and argument about it. We need good stories. Whenever anyone wants to talk about climate change with me, I say, have you ever seen a documentary about Kiribati? You know, one of our nearest island neighbours. Climate change isn't something in the future for them. They've got 50 islands that they've already had to agree they're abandoning. They're no longer sandbagging them, they're no longer growing mangroves. They have already abandoned 50 islands where people used to live and where the politicians themselves come from. It's sort of like a Sophie's Choice of Islands. They have to sit around a little cabinet table and decide which islands are we going to abandon, and each of them comes from one of those islands. So we need to be more, if you want passion, you've got to make it more direct. Now, in terms of education, I would just take half the population out to the King's School, Parramatta, and drive them around there for a day. It'd take you a day to go around their ground. And there are 5 ovals and there are 2 swimming pools. And there are X number of...
6 rifle ranges.
Yeah, you know. It is just extraordinary. That's what I would do to convince people that private schools don't need any extra money.
I guess what I was trying to say was that Labor needs to give leadership on climate change and be bold and be brave, because it's not an easy question to argue sometimes. And that's why I posed it in terms of it needs to tell the truth about climate change, because the truth is very uncomfortable and very difficult. It's not easy because the accusation of alarmism is easy to make. One of the traditional ways in which social democracy, the tradition of social democracy from which Labor comes, one of the ways in which it's garnered public support is by offering protection and security against threats. And my point is that of all the issues that threaten the world, climate change is the one. It's inexorable, it's relentless. There's so much global warming is locked in already. And yet we must do something about it. So protection and security as watchwords for social democracy are what's needed on climate change as well as anything else.
The asylum seekers issue, which is a major moral issue. It's a moral, ethical issue. Now, when we do topics on the policy of both parties, that's not the main point. When we do topics on the asylum seeker crisis, we get an absolutely packed room, okay? And I read recently that there's a real shift occurring in the Australian people about the horrors of Nauru and Manus. So there is a shift occurring about the brutality that has actually been picked up by some polling organisation. So what I'm concerned about is, and I suppose it's a question to you, Meredith, too, is that most people feel that who are getting more and more concerned about the barbarity of this policy, that very little is said by the Labor spokespeople of saying that Labor actually has an alternative to this. And I said this has really been shown by the fact that we get huge audiences when we do that topic. And I read recently that there's a shift occurring in the percentage of people who feel that the policy is actually has to be changed.
The Liberals have this policy which is there can be no chink of light, or I think that's the expression, where they're basically saying they have to have a cruel policy because that's the only way you will be able to stop people getting onto the boats. My position, and really the left's position in the Labor Party, has always been that, well, has been since the 1,000 people being drowned, and where we had to eventually, originally our view was let them come, but after the 2 years of having people drowned at sea, we really had to rethink that. And we now accept the Refugee Council of Australia position, which is that what refugees really want is safety first and then legality. And legality means the right to work, the right to have your kids go to school, and the right to medical care. And that if they have that, they're prepared to sit and wait until decisions are made. So what the Refugee Council is saying is there needs to be a proper regional solution in places like Indonesia, paid for by us, and paid, if you look at what is currently being spent on Manus and Nauru, it's billions of dollars being spent there. Don't believe that it's not. It's billions of dollars. And that if that money was sent to UNHCR, a proper regional solution could occur in Indonesia, and refugees could sit there with their kids being educated and them working and access to medical care while they waited to be re-established. Yeah. Now, that is the position that I now take, because I do accept that just saying let them come means that there will be too many. There were 1,000 people drowned. I can't, and we're still seeing it in the Mediterranean, which is very upsetting. So I accept that. The good thing about Federal Conference of the Labor Party was that we did accept that the $500 billion should go direct to UNHCR. That's the sensible thing to do. The Labor Party always tries to do things multilaterally rather than unilaterally, and that this is a way forward. I was totally opposed, and so was the left, and we almost won that vote about vote turnbacks. I think that's outrageous. It's dangerous. We should not be accepting that as a policy. And what the Labor Party, I think, needs to do is be more open about the cruelty of present policies. I mean, I think it is good that there are no children left on the mainland in detention. That's a good thing. We all knew that was happening, but we all kept quiet about it because we didn't want the Conservatives to fight back against that. I knew that there were families in Brisbane with kids that had been in Brisbane Hospital. We knew that they were being allowed to stay, and they are, but really we're not meant to talk about that because then they might be sent back to Nauru. I mean, there's a lot going on in the refugee area, which is that the people who want a practical solution are taking a different position than the people who just want to be advocates. And I just think it's important that we respect those two positions and accept that, you know, both sides have the best interests of refugees in their hearts.
I agree with much of what Meredith says. I mean, I've never believed in open borders. I think you've got to control who comes in to your country. It's not an oppressive or wrong thing. I wonder, I'm sure, as Wynne says, there's always a packed audience when asylum seekers are discussed. But I would say, one, that's completely doesn't parallel what happens in the broader society, and two, I wonder whether after what's happened in the EU, the European Union, in the last few months, whether people would be. I mean, I was at a Labor Party branch meeting many years ago where one of the members.
It was the Labor Party branch meeting.
It was the Labor Party branch meeting many years ago, when one of the members said, who was not a raving racist or anything, said, well, what would happen if hundreds of thousands of refugees arrived on Australia's doorstep? And of course the rest of us said, oh, that's ridiculous. And on some level it is ridiculous, but that is what has now happened through Turkey and Greece and the former Yugoslavia and so on. What you do in that situation, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess you do what of all people, brave Angela Merkel is trying to do, which is to solve it. Maybe, I mean, the basis of tonight was how can Labor win in 2016. I think it's very difficult to come up with an idea around refugees on which Labor which can be part of displacing a Conservative government. I think the people on Nauru and Manus should be resettled. But if we were to have a resumption of boat journeys, it wouldn't be good politically, it wouldn't be good for the people trying that dangerous journey. I think, and I agree with Meredith, I'd just add that we need a bigger quota of legitimate, a bigger quota of refugees to be allowed in Australia.
Is Labor more likely to win if it emphasises in its policy having a Human Rights Act for Australia, which includes, and this comes back to your point about workers, and also the refugee point and the homeless point, campaigning for a Human Rights Act in Australia which contains provisions similar to, at very least, Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the right to work and to work in good conditions, and Article 25, which is the right to nurture and shelter and so on. Is Labor more likely to win if it incorporates into its policy platform a Human Rights Act which emphasises at least those two articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Well, maybe, but most people don't think of policies in those ways. I mean, we do, we might. Most people look at what parties are offering and say, well, how's it going to affect me? If we can translate the meaning of human rights into something tangible and meaningful in everyday life, then yeah, maybe it can. But look, elections are a time when 1,001 particular issues are raised. It's usually a half a dozen big issues that decide the outcome of an election.
Look, I remember when having a sort of Bill of Rights was a huge issue at the state level, and look, I'd love to say yes, of course we should have a section about human rights in our policies that we take to the election, but I agree with David that in the end it'll be 3 or 4 issues. It'll probably be banks and tax, which are good ones to have as issues in the forefront. But I remember when it was brought up, and one of our lovely I think it was a shadow minister at the time, brought up that we should have a Bill of Rights. And he was just destroyed by all the warriors in the caucus who said, but all a Bill of Rights means is that decisions will be made by lawyers instead of politicians. And people get very anxious about the idea of lawyers making law. They actually would much prefer, I think, the people that they vote for to be the people that make law rather than the lawyers. So although I personally really like a Bill of Rights or a Human Rights Act, it's very easily typified as this is going to be a feast for lawyers, don't have anything to do with it.
Please join me in thanking both of our wonderful speakers for this evening.